Tony Abels was a figure who seamlessly blended into the ordinary, a quiet man with a face you would forget the moment he turned away. Growing up in the small insular town of Grayville, Tony was shy, reserved, and often avoided by his peers, who found him odd. Raised by his mother, a strict woman who held her own demons and kept Tony under a heavy thumb, he learned early on to keep his emotions locked tightly away. His childhood was marked by loneliness, and he found solace in an unusual obsession: tales of crime, horror, and the macabre. These dark fascinations began as innocent escapism, but over time grew into something far more sinister. Tony spent most of his teenage years in isolation. Friends were few, and he quickly became known as that strange boy who preferred to spend time alone, often disappearing into the woods with books on psychology, forensic science, and true crime. At first, his interest in these topics seemed innocent enough, an unusual curiosity, but nothing alarming. However, behind his quiet demeanor, a cold, calculating mind was developing, one that would go on to horrify an entire region. In his early 20s, Tony moved away from Grayville and took up a series of low-profile jobs across various states. He deliberately chose jobs that allowed him to drift from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to draw attention. His unassuming nature allowed him to blend in easily, his co-workers remembering him as quiet and polite, yet forgettable. This lifestyle also gave Tony ample opportunity to study the types of people who went unnoticed, the vulnerable who could vanish without anyone realizing immediately. For Tony, it was a perfect cover. His first murder occurred when he was 26. He was living in a small town in Pennsylvania, working as a night janitor at a local hospital. One night, on his way home, he saw a woman walking alone. She was a drifter, someone who frequented the area but had no fixed address or connections. Driven by the urge he had struggled to suppress for years, Tony followed her down a deserted street. In a flash, he grabbed her, pulling her into the shadows, and committed his first killing. The thrill was unlike anything he had ever experienced. And as he walked away, leaving her body behind, he felt a strange sense of empowerment. The murder went unreported for days until someone stumbled upon the body. With no suspects or witnesses, it was chalked up as a tragic, random attack. Tony felt a deep satisfaction. He had acted on his desires and remained invisible, a ghost in the town's memory. This success only fueled his obsession. He felt invincible, and the urge to kill became harder to resist. Over the next few years, Tony moved from town to town, each time leaving behind a trail of seemingly random murders. He selected his victims carefully, choosing those who existed on the society's margins: transients, runaways, and people who were unlikely to be missed. He often preyed on individuals late at night, ensuring there were no witnesses. Each time he refined his methods, learning from any minor mistakes he made. His murders became brutal yet methodical. He would strike quickly, ensuring his victim had no chance to scream or struggle. And each time, he would linger nearby, watching the aftermath unfold, relishing the confusion and fear he had caused. One of his most notorious murders took place in a small coastal town in Maine. The victim, a young woman named Sarah with a history of drug abuse, was last seen leaving a local bar. Her body was found days later in a nearby forest, carefully hidden but marked with a peculiar arrangement of objects Tony had left as a taunt to the authorities. By this time, he had started to leave behind a specific symbol, a small, crude drawing of a spiral, carved into a nearby surface or scratched onto the victim's belongings. It was his signature, a calling card that linked his killings, though investigators in different jurisdictions failed to make the connection initially. As the years went on, Tony's methods became increasingly bold. He started picking victims from busier places, relishing the risk, the thrill of nearly getting caught. He would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines and vulnerabilities, treating each murder like an art form, and the press began to notice the pattern. The mysterious spiral symbol and the seemingly untraceable killer behind it earned him the moniker The Phantom. Articles began to circulate, and Tony's ego swelled at the notoriety, even if he remained unseen. However, his careful facade began to crack one fateful night. In a rural town in Texas, he attacked a woman who fought back fiercely, scratching his face and drawing blood. Shaken, Tony barely managed to subdue her, but in his haste, he left behind crucial evidence: a few strands of his hair, and traces of his blood. Investigators were able to extract DNA, marking the first significant lead in the case. As law enforcement closed in, Tony grew increasingly paranoid. He changed his appearance, dyed his hair, grew a beard, and began to use fake IDs. Despite his precautions, he found it harder to evade detection, especially as a multi-state task force was formed to catch the Phantom. Tony attempted to go underground, but his compulsion to kill wouldn't let him rest. He managed a few more murders, each sloppier than the last, driven less by skill and more by desperation. His final murder was chaotic. He targeted a couple who had pulled off the highway to rest at a secluded gas station. Tony attempted to subdue them, but they resisted and the noise drew attention. When the gas station attendant spotted him, Tony fled, but the witnesses provided a detailed description to the police. With DNA evidence and a physical description, it wasn't long before the authorities caught up with him. Tony Abels was apprehended in a motel in the middle of nowhere, ending his killing spree. During his trial, his crimes shocked the nation, the sheer number of victims, and the calculated nature of his killings, sending waves of horror across the country. The man who had once been invisible, a ghost in the lives of so many, now stood under the harsh light of public scrutiny. Psychologists attempted to understand what drove him, examining the intricate layers of a mind that had become consumed by darkness and violence. But Tony offered no remorse, no explanation. In his cold, quiet way, he accepted his life sentence, sentenced to a high-security prison where he would spend his days in solitary confinement, the walls around him as silent and unyielding as the life he had chosen. The legend of Tony Abels, the Phantom, lived on in crime books, documentaries, and chilling campfire tales. He had started as a quiet, unassuming man, but by the time his reign of terror ended, he had left a dark, haunting mark on the world. A cautionary tale of the horrors that can lurk beneath even the most unremarkable exteriors.